Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the preseason outlook crops and weather ag econ dialogue. We'll just get started here in a few minutes, give people some time to kind of filter in. But in the meantime, I'm going to we have a pre-webinar poll. There's no right or wrong answers. We're just trying to get your opinion on some questions. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. If you need any technical assistance or if you have any problems, you can just drop us a note in the chat. We can help you out. And same with the Q&A. Anytime you have a question, you can drop it in there. So I will go ahead and launch that poll. If you have a minute and want to take the poll, there's 3 questions. The first question is about interest rates. Second question is about what's the definition of a light rain? And then the third question is about fertilizer. So could just take our poll and if we get enough responses, we can share the answers and get a feel for what everyone's thinking for this year. For those of you just filtering in, welcome to the AgriCon Dialogue for March. We'll get started here in a couple minutes, but in the meantime, if you want, you can answer the poll question on your screen. We're just some general questions to get your feedback and your thoughts going into this growing season. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So if you got any last minute answers, go ahead and put them in. And just a friendly reminder, if you have any technical difficulties or need any assistance, you can send all the panelists a chat. In the bottom, there should be a chat button. And then if you want to ask a question, you can also put that in the Q&A so everyone can see all the questions in the Q&A. Or if you want to just message the panelists, our host specifically, you can put that in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and we'll look at the results. So interest rates on land loans are a major factor when deciding to purchase rangeland or farmland. So most of you agree, 83% agree, 17% disagree. What's the definition of a light rain? And maybe I don't know if Laura, if you have is there a scientific definition for this? But enough to settle the dust, 75%. So I would agree with that.
Yeah, I did not come up with that question. I think Heather Kester did. That's a good answer though, I think.
Enough to cancel spraying, enough to ruin hay. Depends how bad we need it to rain. Yep. And I have purchased all my fertilizer for the season. So 45% of people haven't, and 27% of people have, and then 27% of people have purchased some. So thanks for taking a minute to answer our poll, and we'll go ahead and get started. First up, we have Laura Edwards. She's going to do a weather outlook, and she's our SDSU Extension State Climatologist.
Okay, is this getting to screen share there? So I can't really keep an eye on the chat very well during the talk, so I'll answer questions at the end, but if there's something really urgent, Sarah, you can sure interrupt me. So yeah, talking about the spring outlook today, so we'll spring and summer. We just got new information yesterday, so this is kind of hot off the press. As I haven't really advertised any of this information yet. So we'll first start though with kind of what we saw last year and last growing season, a couple highlights or lowlights, if you want to call it that, as far as kind of notable events throughout the growing season. I'll kind of touch on how likely or unlikely some of those things might happen here this year. First of all, looking at the growing season last year, April through October, this was the average temperature anomaly, or how different from average temperatures we saw last year from April through October. Everywhere across the board was warmer than average. less so up in the north central part of the state, but more so on the edges, kind of the south, southwest, southeast, or eastern side of the state, a little bit higher departures from normal for the season. But like everywhere, we saw a lot of ups and downs throughout the year. It was not consistently warmer throughout the course of the growing season, but most were, out in the far east in that 2 to 2.5 degree range above normal, similar down in the southwest and the northwest. If you want to look at how that ranks historically, we have 131 years of climate history documented for the country, and this is showing where each county ranked here for April through October, again, for the growing season. Those counties that are in the darker orange color were in the top 10th percentile, so pretty high. So even if it was only 2 to 2.5 degrees above average for the season, that actually ranks in the top 10th percentile for a number of these counties. The highest ones were about 123rd out of 131 years, so about eighth highest. That would be down in Fall River County and a handful of counties out in the east. 122nd to 123rd warmest. So, but everywhere else in the lighter orange color, you're in the top third warmest, historically speaking. So still, I think that helps with crop development, as we had wetter than average conditions over much of the area, especially central and north, as I'll show in a little bit. So a little warmth helped with some of the moisture conditions that we had throughout the growing season. I kind of talked about the 131-year history that we have for data across the country. And here's South Dakota on average. Granted, there's a lot of local variability. And if you look at this, this is at NOAA's Climate at a Glance. You can get into county level data like the maps I just showed you. They're from the same source. But here looking at April through October, statewide now average temperature, Avery growing season from 1895 through last year. And you can see the trend line in the blue. The last normal period that we used 30-year normals in climatology. And so the last 30-year period was 91 to 2020. And that's the black line. That's the what we call average now. And you can see over the last 5 years, we've been consistently above average in temperature, even above trend line statewide. And certainly the early 2020s, we saw about 3-year string of generally dry drought conditions, which often is accompanied by warmer than average temperatures. So that's consistent with kind of this long-term kind of low-level drought that we've seen, especially in the southwest and a little in the southeast in recent years. But yeah, certainly we're still above average. We've been above average here for a few years, several years in a row now. But there's a lot, but we're general on the increasing trend, about 1 degree over the course of the last 100 years. And again, like I showed you, 2 to 2.5 degrees puts you in the top 10th percentile. So 1 degree Fahrenheit over that time can be significant. Looking at the temperature side of, precipitation side of things here, again, looking at the growing season from April through October last year, really quite wet conditions in those darker green areas. If you're in the northeastern part of the state, there is quite a bit of flooding in the summer out in that Big Stone, Ortonville area. That'd be, I believe, Grant County, Roberts Grant County. Quite wet conditions as well out in the northwest. Meade, Ziebach County had a couple really wet periods in the spring spring or summer, and again in the fall. So when we're looking at, these are the departures from average, and looking at Perkins County, Corson County, you're close to 10 inches here. Ziebach County, about 12 inches above average. Out here, Grant Roberts County, 7 to 8 inches. So really quite wet conditions, which at the time I believe was good, as we were starting this time last year in drought conditions. So some of that was welcome, but I think some of it brought a little extra rain, at least I know on the northeast side, a little more than they wanted. Just looking back at the month of August in particular, in the eastern side of the state, we had a handful of individual locations that recorded their wettest August on record, including Huron, Britton up in Marshall County, and a few areas in between there. And some of those individual station records go back to the 1880s, even older than the 1895 here that we have in this data set. So really exceptional rainfall in the month of August, at least on the eastern side of the state. So here's where we were looking at departure from average for the season. When you look at how does that rank historically, again, 1895 through last year, you see Ziebach County stick out as the record wettest for that county, but you got a lot of close ones. 130th, Perkins County, that's the second wettest. Corson, and these other counties here, 129th, that's second wettest. So you're talking top 5, and a lot of these in the Northwest, and a couple here out in the east as well. But you'll notice down in the Sioux Falls area, along that eastern I-90 corridor on the eastern side of the state, not so exciting. Minnehaha County actually was below average, ranking 41st, so in the bottom third, driest on record. And a handful in the gray are in that middle third, historically speaking. So nothing really exciting there as far as moisture goes for last growing season. I think they had adequate, from what I understand, adequate moisture, but ended up on the dry side. And then they had a quite dry fall as well following that. So, and I'll show that a little bit more in the drought monitor when we get to there. Statewide precipitation, again, we have an increasing trend generally across the state. There's some seasonal differences, but this is just looking at April through October, the key growing season. So you can see the really high year, that's 2019, wettest year on record, head and shoulders above 1915, which was the previous wettest year on record. So 2019 will be the year to beat for quite a long time. So I think we can wait on that. That was quite exceptional. But last year in general, statewide, a little above average, again, really driven by the Northwest and Northeast. And here you can see the early 2020s, where we had about a 3-year run, consecutive year run of below average precipitation that drove drought across the state on and off of different severity over that time. So you can see we've kind of pulled out of it a little bit compared to history, but we are on the increasing trend statewide, about 1.5 to 2 inches over the last 100 years. Some other eastern locations have steeper trends than that, getting a little bit wetter faster than the west. So a couple notable things last year that maybe the growers you work with, or if you farm yourself, have dealt with. And one was tar spot in corn. It was a really exploding year last year for that particular disease. And a lot of it was driven by favorable climate or environmental conditions. As we look in retrospect now, this is looking at the average humidity as measured by dew point temperature for June, July, and August of last year. And looking at the multi-state area, which really had a really big expansion of tar spot issues from Iowa, Nebraska, and northward up to North Dakota. all that area in the maroon was record highest humidity, record highest dew point for the summer season last year. So that really brought on favorable moisture conditions. If you guys remember last year, I know we like to forget it, but a lot of mornings with dew, a lot of mosquitoes. We didn't have much wind to really move air and dry things out. We were just getting consistently southerly flow from the south, which is where our moisture comes from in the summer season typically, but we weren't getting those drying winds coming in from the north, which if you think about the alternate scenario, we would have gotten a little bit of Canadian smoke from wildfires. So what we did, it was very relatively calm as far as wind speeds go, and very high humidity, both contributed factors to tar spot. Also having that general airflow from the south brought up that disease from the south that does not overwinter here. I suspect, and visiting with my other kind of agriculture, climatology colleagues around the region, we do not suspect this year will be the same as bad as last year. First things, there's drought right now in the southern states, southern plains area, which is kind of where this disease comes from for us anyway. And so they might not have as much inoculum, as much disease pressure as they did last year to kind of spread it northward. So that's the first thing. Also, just looking at weather and climate patterns, we really just had a confluence of just kind of a black swan type of scenario with high pressure parked over like the Bermuda Triangle area, and just that, like I said, consistently southerly flow. That's very unusual to see that. So I don't think we're going to see quite the same situation this year as last year. Not as much pressure, but I think we did learn our lesson to get out there and scout early and often. The other kind of interesting thing from last year was a very early frost or near frost the first weekend in September. So depending where you're at in the state, I know people here on the webinar are kind of from all over. This was the date of the first 32-degree frost measured last fall. So anywhere in the kind of the blue areas, measured one in September, which was that first weekend, September 6th and 7th, right after Labor Day. And we had two nights, that Saturday and Sunday, or the mornings rather. Saturday and Sunday both got, if they didn't get to 32, they got really close, so like 34 degrees even, in that 33 to 36 range, which at that time was enough to basically have freeze damage on some of the corn crop in particular. I also heard about it in some of the horticulture crops like pumpkins and things like that, where the crops just were not ready, were not mature, and ready for temperatures that cold. I heard of a handful of areas in the north and west that had as much as 100 bushel loss, in some of those areas, even though they didn't get down to freezing necessarily. So very early frost, about 4 or 5 weeks at least earlier than typical for that time of year. But again, they didn't have to get down to freezing necessarily to see some crop damage. So that was, again, a very unusual event. You can't really forecast for, unfortunately, you get these kind of fluke days where it's clear skies, calm winds, and the temperature just drops very rapidly and it gets very cold. So since harvest time, here's where we've seen temperatures as compared to average. And this is looking across south. This is as of a couple days ago. But again, everyone has been warmer than average. We've had what we thought would be a La Nina year, which is a La Nina season in the winter, but it did not behave like a typical La Nina, which generally brings colder than average temperatures, especially in the month of February. This winter was not like that at all. We had some very warm temperatures in that mid to actually throughout the winter, but especially the midwinter season, like in January. Out west, certainly the highest differences from average, in that 6 to 8 degree range above average since November 1st. But out east too, you're looking at that 3 to 4 to 5 degree range. So again, pretty warm temperatures over the winter season and into this early spring season. Precipitation kind of depends where you're at. So if you're in this northeast region around Clark, Webster area, a little bit wetter than average, kind of along the northern tier, you see more in that 100%. This is percents now, where oranges are drier, the blues are wetter than average. But you'll see down along the southern tier of the state, gosh, you have something as low as 18%, 40 in around the 50% range. And out here in Custer County, that's where they have the big fire going on right now, 39% of average precipitation over the winter season. So really quite dry conditions. And the lack of snowfall, on the agriculture side, we don't think about snowfall or about winter really mattering too much when it comes to drought conditions, but it does in some environments, and the Black Hills is one of them, where they really depend on that snowpack for multiple reasons, but also to reduce the risk of fire, which they just did not have this year. Snowfall, again, very few locations, handful of locations in the light blue have had above average snowfall, but the way it's kind of worked this winter is kind of different. We've had episodes of snowfall, and then it's been melting in between. So we haven't had consistent snowpack throughout the winter season, but you see a lot of areas below average for snowfall, a lot of orange and red on the map. So again, kind of supporting the snow drought, we call it, and what that means for recreation and other things too. I'm going to talk about soil moisture just a little bit. This is from our South Dakota Mesonet, our weather station network, and this is what we call the poker chip map. I've shown this a number of times to different groups. I'll say that each disk represents a different sensor at depth, and they're not spaced out evenly in depth-wise throughout the profile. They're at 4, 8, 12, 20, and 40 inches. So the deeper ones are a little further spaced out. But you can kind of get a relative idea here of what layers of soil are doing better moisture-wise and which ones are struggling a little bit. The blues are wetter, the oranges and yellows are drier. The ones that you see grayed out are individual sensors that are at freezing temperatures, so we don't report the moisture for those sensors if they're freezing. So that will not show here, but you can see here out in the Southwest in particular, you have a lot of yellows and oranges that show drier conditions. Even in the North Central, you see a couple of these deeper sensors that are a little bit drier, even though last year and the data we show that they've actually been wetter in general. And then it's not unusual when you see these sensors thaw out in the spring that you'll see a quick little bump up in moisture as whatever moisture's in the soil also thaws out and triggers that sensor to kind of bump up a little bit, let them settle down a little bit, and then you kind of get a better idea of what the typical moisture or average moisture conditions are in that area. But in general, in the east, north, adequate moisture at this time. I have not seen anything that leads to saturated soils really in any big area, at least as far as row crops go. So I see a very low potential for prevent plant being a widespread concern over this growing season, and at least to start, so that's good. And then I'll mention maybe this later too, but also try to conserve moisture to hold what you got. So that means keep it ahead of weeds as you can. Try to keep those fields clean so that you don't have other things taking up that really essential moisture that you need for your actual crop that you're growing. And I'll look at frost step 2. This is looking at how much frost we have in the ground as of yesterday. Again, using the mesonet, a lot of stations are thawed through the profiles. We've had some very warm temperatures here. Even despite the cold and snow over the weekend, things are thawed. And up in the ones that do have frost, the deepest frost is maybe 20 inches. And I wouldn't be surprised with high temperatures pushing 80 plus today and tomorrow, that we'll see a lot more stations thaw out here in the next couple of days. The drought monitor, I just have about 5 minutes left here, so I'll try to squeeze through the rest of this. Drought monitor, we'll zoom into South Dakota. D1 or worse, D1 through D4 is how we define drought. That yellow color D0, we don't actually call that drought. That's just dryness, abnormally dry. That could be going into or coming out of drought. We don't typically see many severe impacts with that or anything. But this has gradually gotten worse over the winter and early spring season. So currently statewide, we have about 42% of the state in some level of drought. This red area out in the west was just introduced yesterday's map for this week, this D3 area. And there is a D3 that was last week introduced in the southeast. So if you have farmers, ranchers, that are looking at potential drought disaster relief with USDA, something to keep an eye on, as I believe those programs will start to trigger, I believe around April 15th is when the growing season starts. Whenever that grazing forage season starts, that's when they start looking at the drought monitor map for the livestock forage program, for example. So keep an eye on that if you have interest in those areas for emerging drought. Again, I've kind of hit this, that we've seen improvements in the green almost everywhere across the state, except for the southeast and the far west, Black Hills area, where we've seen some actually degradation since a year ago this time. So just to note how much we've seen change recently. In the interest of time, I'll kind of skip this. I've heard a lot about Super El Nino. Gosh, it's kind of hard. We will get through a neutral phase of this summer. So El Nino is not a big worry right now for us. When we look at different El Nino, La Nina, or neutral phases, how does that relate to corn yield? Looking at the far right, neutral conditions slightly favor higher corn yield in South Dakota. The central part of the state, maybe less so, but again, not really big trends any which way. So neutral conditions are not bad for us in the Western Corn Belt out here. Do see El Nino developing into the fall for next winter. Often that brings warmer than average temperatures. So something to keep an eye on, but it'll be late this year. Not worried about that this summer affecting corn or any kind of crop production. Next 7 days look very quiet. If you've looked at the forecast, very quiet precipitation wise across most of the U.S. Maybe a couple sprinkles out in the far northwest of South Dakota, but very quiet over the next 7 days. And as we look out, let's look at 2 weeks, so through the end of March, warmer than average temperatures favored, and precipitation, kind of a toss-up. Nothing really clear either way on that, but we are starting to increase our climatological chances. So just baseline, our chances of getting wetter are increasing now as you get into April. But we don't see anything really big happening as far as moisture goes through the rest of March. Pretty quiet weather-wise. The information released yesterday was April climate outlook in the next season. So definitely looking at what we've already see coming down the pike for April shows favoring warmer than average conditions. That's the map on the left for most of South Dakota here. Precipitation slightly favoring wetter in the eastern side of the state. Not really high chances, but something to keep an eye on. They will update this map on the last day of the month, which would be the 31st. So this is kind of the first look that was released yesterday. So in another week and a half, we'll see how things kind of evolve for the month of April. Again, looking at April through June, that 3-month period, similar pattern, still slightly favoring warmer than average temperatures. I don't think that's really anything to be worried about right now. But we do see drier than average conditions hinting at the southwestern side of the state, which is already, like I said, in pretty severe drought. So a little bit of a concern there, at least for the forage grazing pasture areas and water for livestock. And June through July, just looking at the middle of the summer, increasing likelihood of warmer than average temperatures. You see that deeper oranges in the mid-summer season. So that's a little bit concerning when we combine that with a hint towards drier conditions, at least in the southern part of the state. Again, that's an area that's already in drought. So maybe they can get enough moisture in the spring to kind of at least hold steady, if not slightly improve their situation. But looks like could see consistent or re-emerging drought in southern part of South Dakota as we get into that mid-season time frame. So a couple things of concern there. Again, I think soil conditions right now look pretty good. Not worried about flooding. A lot of green dots on a lot of the rivers, indicating really less than 50% chance of any flood. Just a couple points on the typical James River orange areas. Better than 50% chance of minor flooding, but it's like 55 to 60%. Nothing really exciting there on the flood side. So with that, I just wanted to leave you with the updated map of the Mesonet stations, our live weather stations. There's over 100 in the ground right now. They still have about 50 more, 45, 50 more to install in the next 2 years. So if you don't see a dot near you right now, there may be one coming here pretty soon. So when that network's all built out, about 40 to 50 miles between each station when they're all done. So they've been doing a great job, and that live data is coming in every 5 minutes. So I will skip to the end here, and I'll leave my contact information up there. Sorry I went a few minutes late, Sarah.
No, you're good. You're good. We have a couple of minutes. If we have some questions, feel free to type them in the chat. If you type it in the chat, it'll go to the panelists and hosts, and we can share your question we can see your question, or you could type it in the Q&A, and everyone can see your question if you put it in there. So questions for Laura. That's great information to have. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I'll stick around the webinar, so if you think of a question later, you can just drop that in the Q&A as well while Matt is speaking. Okay.
Thank you, Laura.
Yep.
So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Matt Elliott. He's an associate professor and extension specialist in agribusiness. And today he's going to be going over crop prices, trade, and marketing. So thank you, Matt.
Yep, thanks, Sarah. So I'm Matthew Elliott. I generally cover the grain markets here at South Dakota State University. So typically at this point in time in the year, we're looking at our starting balance sheets and thinking about, where, changes of those that could happen throughout the year and how that might affect prices. But given the Iranian conflict and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, it certainly added an additional uncertainty to the marketplace for corn, soybeans, and fertilizer prices and energy prices. that's going to add, an extra random variable, it looks like, to the marketing for this year. So mostly today, I don't have a presentation. We built several different interactive market reports that kind of bring in, real-time data that we can provide to users to follow along throughout the growing year. Um, and then also interact with it. And so there's a lot of data that is on our page. So what the one main website for grain reports is at agland.sdstate.edu /grain. And that's kind of the main one I'll be going over. But there's another one that follows South Dakota basis specifically. And so just substitute basis here instead of the grain on the /. Um, but there's a lot of information, and we keep adding, or I keep thinking of different things to put in here. New APIs from the USDA come online, and different things that we can add, different data streams. So more than happy to, if you have suggestions on data you might want to see, or how you might want to, how you want to interpret or see that data in a chart or a map or something like that, certainly you can shoot me an email. We can have these updated pretty quickly. But the general page, you just start out with a simple, overview page, and then each major crop in the region, corn, soybeans, wheat, has its own drop down with a bunch of data and charts related to each one of those. We also cover different transportation, so rail, barges, how grain's moving, if there's railroad complications and things like that's under transportation, following the fertilizer to a certain extent as well. So there's just a lot of information. But for right now, for just talking about grain markets, I'll start with corn. And just typically how the corn market works is that USDA comes out with their initial balance sheet numbers for supply demand. Where they think prices are going to go over this next marketing year. And so we'll start really, there'll start being adjustments to this balance sheet starting in May from USDA, but they come out with this initial one in February at their USDA Outlook conference. And so that's what we're looking at here for corn is basically what they think is going to happen 26-27 compared to the previous marketing year. And so what's really important is kind of the assumptions and changes, and especially for corn. So like last year in 2020, 25 and 2026, we had a lot more corn acres, more than the market even anticipated. At the beginning of the year, we were thinking like 94 million, but at the end of the year, or by the January report, they're saying 98.8 million acres of corn was harvested or planted, excuse me, and 91.3 million of that was harvested. And so that created a lot of production because not only do we have a lot of acres, but we had pretty good yields last year compared to the previous years and above trend line yields. So the combination of large acres plus the good yield created a lot of production, almost 3 billion, 2 to 3 billion bushels more in corn production than we probably anticipated. And so that kind of weighed on the market prices, and that's why you saw prices pretty depressed through most of last year. So looking out now is for this next upcoming marketing year, we're USDA is bringing down that 98.8 million, saying about 4.8 million acres is probably going to go to mostly soybeans next year. And certainly given what's happening with fertilizer prices, the concern or the thought process is maybe even that acreage number is going to come down even more just because nobody's going to be able to either get enough fertilizer or they don't want to pay enough given these prices. Where the margins don't make sense. So we might not see quite 94 million acres of corn this year. So we'll find out in a March 30th planting intentions report that's coming up at the end of the month. That'll be kind of key to our first key to see if those acres are really in line with what producers are thinking, or if those intentions are changing or have changed given some of the changes in fertilizer prices and so forth. Um, Right now, USDA, given their trendline yield model, is showing 183 bushel per acre yield, which is down 3.5 bushels from our pretty good yields last year. So, that's assuming we just have normal weather, not great weather, not bad weather. So if we have either one of those, because of weather-related, things happening this spring or especially during pollination in July, that yield can fluctuate quite a bit and that can change this balance sheet quite a bit going forward. Beginning stocks, basically at the end of this marking year, where USDA sees that we're going to bring in about 2 billion bushels, a lot more than the previous 1.5 billion bushels from the previous year. Imports don't really change. On the demand side, USDA is forecasting right now 200 million bushel less in feed demand for next year compared to this year, seeing about the same amount of ethanol at 5.6 billion bushels. And so really the only demand kind of change thing is feed and residual is down and exports are expected to be less this marketing year from 3.3 billion bushels down to 3.1 billion bushels. And that kind of reflects a tightening of the ending stocks, a tightening of the stocks to use ratio, and a higher price in this next year. So maybe our exports are not going to be nearly as competitive as they were in earlier this year when we had pretty depressed prices. So the big key of the balance sheet, so as you're adjusting these, or USDA is adjusting this balance sheet throughout the year, the big thing to kind of look for what and how that works with price is the stocks to use ratio. And that's just basically taking these ending stocks divided by what the USDA projects as total use. That gives a kind of how relative the supply and demand situation, how tight or loose stocks are, and that's pretty dependent on prices. And you can kind of get a sense of how that works in the stocks to use price graph analysis that we have here. And so on the x-axis is the cash price of corn, anywhere between 3 and 7.5 bushels, or $3.50 per bushel. And then your stocks to use ratio here on the x-axis. So right now, this 25-26 marketing year, we're looking at a 12.9% stocks to use ratio. Generally, your stocks to use and price are pretty related. It has this inverse relationship. And so when we're right on this line, basically we're right where we would expect given what WASD has for stocks to use. Anytime the market is deviating from the line, it's saying that supply seem tighter or looser than what WASD is reporting right now, and they're pricing in either more of a bullish or bearish scenario. And so that's kind of what we're being discussing in our price and fundamental analysis in this sheet on the side. Right now, since we're basically our price is where we would predict for this kind of stocks to use ratio, we really don't have a signal one way or the other on the market compared to WASD. It's pretty neutral. It's pretty much expected. You can certainly change the markets and things like that, but it's probably good just to kind of look at all the markets when we're doing this type of analysis for price analysis. Specifically to South Dakota. So if we come down here to the production analysis and we come down to South Dakota, because there are differences here. So South Dakota in 2025 had a pretty good yield, just like the Corn Belt states, but probably a little bit better even than nationally. So we typically our trend line yield in 2025 would have been about 163 bushels per acre. We actually got 171, which is quite a bit higher. And if you combine that with our larger acres, our acres in corn jumped up quite a bit, almost 700,000 more corn acres in South Dakota last year than the previous, or what we would expect. It ended up creating a lot more production in South Dakota alone. We were over 1 billion bushels of corn production for the first time ever in our history. And so all that local corn production really has kind of weighed in on local prices, especially on basis in South Dakota. And so that's one thing I'll kind of talk here in just a second about. Looking at world stocks for corn. If you go here to corn and then you go to the world supply here, basically world corn production and stocks are all up, largely because the U.S. is the main driver of corn production. And you can see that in the stacked bar charts. So the United States is in this blue area. We are by far the largest producer, uh, pretty big exporter. Brazil would be the other big kind of, they're not as big of a producer, but they export a lot of it. China's also a big producer, but they basically domestically consume all of their corn in order not to import any from the U.S. or any other countries. So the big one to look at is usually Brazil and Argentina because they typically compete with us on the export market. And so if there's production shortfalls for corn in Brazil or Argentina, then we typically see a pickup a little bit in exports. And right now, USDA last year, Brazil had 126 million metric ton corn crop. Right now, they're projecting 132 million metric ton corn crop. But that corn crop is right in. It's kind of they just got it planted. They just harvested their soybeans. They're trying to put in that second corn crop, and they've been having some issues in Brazil with getting some of those acres in because of drought or delayed harvesting and different things. And so my anticipation would be to see this Brazilian export or production number come down, and then we would have less export pressure from Brazil on our corn, and we might actually see a pickup in exports, as we progress throughout the year. And that kind of we have a page in our thing called the demand tracker right here, demand pace tracker. And this kind of tracks, what is how much ethanol we've produced, and we can kind of extrapolate how much crushed or how much corn was used to make that ethanol. We also have the updated weekly information on how much exports are being inspected on boats or on a rail to various countries. And so we have a pretty good tally of where we are relative to demand or what USDA is projecting on those two demand components. And so right now we're probably just a little bit shy of what USDA is projecting. So on ethanol, again, they're saying we're going to use about 5.6 billion bushels of ethanol in this 2025 or 2026 marketing year. At March 13th here, last data point we have, we're pretty much on pace, maybe just slightly less than that. On exports, we're slightly below the 3.3 billion bushels that USDA is projecting. The feed and residual number, we only get basically a good glance at how much feed and residual we're using through our quarterly stocks. So they only happen 4 times throughout the year. And so not only are we going to get our planting intentions report on March 30th, but we're going to get our quarterly stocks reports on March 30th. So that's going to be a big number to look at. So right now, kind of stay on pace of the feed and residual number. We definitely want to see something probably below 10.3 because it's actually I don't have a seasonal adjustment in there. Typically, we feed more corn during the winter months, and then cattle and different dairy we can use pasturage and different things to feed them during the spring and summer months. So you usually see a lot more corn feed use during the winter months. So we really probably need to be below this 10.3 billion bushels on our March 30 stocks reports for March 1. So anything probably around the 9 maybe definitely a 9 would probably be a bullish aspect for the market, would indicate that pretty strong feed and residual is going on through the winter months for corn, and that our stocks to use might be a little bit tighter than we expect, and so that would actually support prices. Um, a couple things just real quick on the futures analysis right now. Futures has been fairly kind of I guess it's been pretty much in a very tight trading window all the way up till here as the Iranian conflict started going, and the energy prices and the commodity complex started lifting up. We started seeing a pretty good bull run here on corn. So right now we're in a pretty good bullish, strong trend on corn. On the May contract, we're at 466. There's, the December harvest contract for new crop is about 490. And then some of the March for 2027 is actually above $5. So there's pretty good prices, good pricing opportunities, given kind of the fundamental bearishness of the stocks situation and so forth, all because of this uncertainty related to Iran. Certainly, maybe opportune times to start locking in prices, especially if you have your fertilizer already pre-booked and so forth. We certainly update this fundamental information, kind of to talk about support and resistance points, where we are within the high and so forth, so you can kind of follow that along. When you look at corn futures seasonality, we've been pretty weak from a seasonal standpoint. Typically, we would see about 104% of our average annual price at this time of year. Usually you have your strongest prices during this April, May, June time period when there's the acreage is uncertain. We might have wet periods during planting. This is when the risk and uncertainty is generally the highest. But because of our larger production and different things, we kind of been running a lot less than what our typical seasonal pattern has been. But that's actually picked up because of the Iranian conflict. And so we're starting to see some more of a seasonally strong, at least locally right now. We're not up to our historical seasonal 103% of the annual average price quite yet. And so that's something to look at. As for South Dakota basis, we do have a separate South Dakota basis report that kind of covers it by county. So if you go to the seasonal, that's maybe the easiest way, unless you want to get all the data for your specific county. You can certainly do that, but the kind of the seasonal over all the South Dakota, typically for the month of March here, we would be, our average basis for corn is about minus 54 cents. So that means usually our cash prices are about 54 cents below what Chicago futures is running. And that covers transportation costs, our local supply demand, and different things to get it to export markets like in the PNW or to ethanol facilities in the Central Corn Belt or whatnot. But right now, even though our average is typically minus 54 cents, we're actually averaging right now across the state for basis about minus 78 cents. That's pretty low. That's like in the 6th percentile. We've seen worse. We saw worse back here in 2014 at this time of year, but it's not good. I mean, it's one of the worst basis. And again, that goes back to we have 1 billion bushels of corn produced in South Dakota. We only have so much demand, so much capacity to get that out to export markets and crush it or use it ourselves in ethanol facilities. And so it's weighing on our local supply and demand markets. And that's why our basis is really weak right now. Now turning to soybeans and the soybean outlook right now. So, where are some of those corn acres, those 4 million acres of corn that were taken from that balance sheet from last year, it's pretty much all going towards soybeans is what the market's anticipating, what the USDA is anticipating, and that could even get worse. So if we're lowering corn acres because fertilizers get more expensive and the margins are not good, then it's probably we're pretty likely to see soybean acres even increase from this 85 million, maybe up to 86, 87, which would be a very bearish type of thing to the soybean market to see that kind of acres. So my concern would be that if you're planning on shifting, you want to certainly be more proactive on trying to market some soybeans here in the near term to try to at least reduce your risk to a large soybean acreage number that's going to weigh in on prices. Uh, and soybean yields were like corn, were better or than maybe what we expected from a trend line, but pretty much even with what we got last year on a national level. Um, but given the more acres, we had about 200 million more bushels in production, and we're expected to carry in a little bit more. Imports are basically staying the same. Crush, soybean crush, USDA expects to go up a little bit more. We are building renewable diesel capacity, crush capacity in the United States, and we're using more of that soybeans for renewable diesel for the jet fuel market. Um, and so that's largely reflected in this increase, almost of 100 million bushels in demand for crush. Exports, USDA right now is expecting a kind of a rebound. We had a pretty, the marketing year for this that we're finishing up is pretty low right now for soybean U.S. exports of a 1.5 billion bushels, and that's partly related to, if you recall back in the fall, China and the Trump administration had a lot of back and forth language about we weren't going to import soybeans from the United States. We were going to try to delay as many purchases given the large tariff and talk and all that kind of stuff. So China was being very skittish about importing U.S. soybeans. So we didn't, during the typical harvest time of the year when we export a lot of our soybeans to China, we were seeing that those sales not really materializing. And so that's why USDA was lowering that from our typical like 1.7, 1.8 billion bushel export program to about 1.5. They think that's going to be rebound 1.7 billion bushels. But again, Trump and President Xi of China was supposed to meet here in the next couple of weeks, but they've delayed that meeting now. And a part of that meeting, there was this, an agreement to buy a certain amount of soybeans, and it's kind of a little bit of uncertain whether it was for this marketing year or the upcoming marketing year. And so we're just going to have to see because there's a lot of geopolitics at play on China importing U.S. soybeans, and they're using that as kind of a political fulcrum in leveraging in those negotiations. And so we'll just have to see how that materializes. One thing I will say, so like I said, South America has just harvested their soybeans. They're really cranking up their export program. Most of it's going to China from Brazil, from Argentina. They've stopped some boats from Brazil because they're finding a lot of pesticide contamination, different foreign material contamination. And so that's kind of created kind of a backlog a little bit in Brazil. We might be able to pick up a few boats or a few sales on that and actually pick up our export pace, which we've kind of seen. So right now, we're looking at an 8.2% stocks to use ratio in soybeans. We see that lowering to 8%. That actually, according to USDA, would support a higher farm price of about 10 cents a bushel. Right now, we're way above that, even when you figure in basis, a weaker basis. And because of the futures market has really kind of taken off with this whole Iranian concern, and then expectations that we might actually get a lot more soybean exports to China, given these ongoing negotiations and the potential meeting with President Xi and President Trump. Um, so if we look at, for example, the stocks of use and price analysis right now, where we are at with that 8.2 or 8% stocks of use and how that reflects on prices. Um, Give it a second to load here. Sometimes this is fast, sometimes it's not, depending on USDA's API. We'll see if it's going to load. It seems like it's giving me some issues here. Doesn't seem to be wanting to load. I'll flip to one of these other sheets for right now until I'll come back to that. Just talking about soybean world production. Um, again, um, this is actually for corn. Let me get the right one. This is the world soybean production. Again, Brazil is by far the largest world producer of soybeans. They export quite a bit of them. Argentina is a pretty good producer of soybeans, but they generally crush a lot of theirs and they export the meal. But they've kind of changed that policy here recently, given different dynamics with what's going on with the U.S.-China trade. United States, we've kind of become, we used to be the dominant producer of soybeans, the dominant exporter, but we've certainly taken second fiddle to Brazil. So right now, USDA, they keep increasing Brazilian soybean production was 171.5 million metric tons last year. Now this year they're forecasting 180 million metric tons. Haven't really heard too many reports to suggest that production's different than what USDA is expecting right now. So certainly going to see a large export competition from Brazil, and certainly could see that um, um, from the from Argentina as well. Let me go to the server and see if I can get my stocks to use price analysis to pop up here. Yeah, I don't know. I was trying to run that on the local computer. So here again, so we have stocks to use for soybeans on the x-axis. We're looking at this 8.2% stocks to use that we have currently on our balance sheet, and then where that would put prices. Again, we're about right where we would expect 11.43 cash price right now. So again, with an 8.3, 8.2% stocks to use, we're looking at 11.43 average market price for soybeans, um, uh, uh, you know, over the across the corn belt here, but you can go up and down this thing. So if we can get down, say stocks to use falls down to into 7% or 6% area, certainly we can start testing that $13 a bushel. Or if we have more acres because corn's shifting, and different things like that. So we're going to build stocks to use from 8% up to say 10%. We can certainly start pressuring those $10 cash prices and things like that. So stocks to use is a big driver in all of this. You can definitely track how prices and stocks to use is materializing throughout the year, using this analysis right here. As we turn to futures analysis, again, we've seen a very bullish trend since the Iranian conflict, and maybe even before. It started really back in February, and that was partly related to anticipations of bigger export program for soybeans because of the China U.S. trade talks and different things. But when those things got called off here on Tuesday or delayed, postponed, we saw a limit drop in soybeans from the high Bollinger Band part back down to about where the moving average is. So that trade talk between President Trump and President Xi is kind of really driving what people are thinking about soybeans going forward. And so that's something to continue to watch. So if those trade talks come back on, we get a big commitment from China to import more U.S. soybeans. We could certainly see a stronger uh, price as related to that. Um, going forward. So one thing about the um, I'm trying to find my soybean demand pace. Right now, we can track exports, we can track crush again using those quarterly stocks reports. Right now, our exports for soybeans are pretty much ahead of where USDA is projecting. Again, they're projecting that 1.575 billion bushels. We're up here. We're well ahead of our target pace to meet that. But soybeans is definitely seasonal, so we could certainly see because Brazilian competition, this just taper off and we get more back on track. So we'll just have to watch that. And again, that comes into play with all of this trade talk and different things I keep mentioning. One other thing on seasonality related to soybeans, we're a little bit better, more at our seasonal typical period or pace. Um, we typically see seasonal prices strongest for soybeans April, May, June. Right now, we're about a little bit above our annual average price at 100.4%, and we're typically about 101.4%. So futures prices, given the Iranian thing, given that expectations for additional export demand to China, has created that dynamic. Um, Kind of running out of time here. Maybe a couple more things I wanted to discuss related to um, South Dakota basis for soybeans. If we look at our soybean seasonal basis chart, typically for the month of March, we would have a minus 84% basis here in South Dakota. Right now, we're about minus 91 cents. So below average, not as bad as corn. We've seen a lot worse basis in different times, 2019, for example. And this was right during the middle of the previous Trump tariff situation that we had, that really weak basis. But we've seen some pretty weak bases before in this. And so we're not nearly it's not the worst case scenario. Certainly not seeing strong basis. And that goes back to South Dakota soybean production was better. We had higher yields, we had higher acres, and so we have a lot more local soybean supply than we typically do. Um, One more thing related to the grain report I was going to mention. Obviously, the big talk right now is with the Iranian conflict and fertilizer prices. Um, so earlier this year, during December, we were looking at roughly for urea, roughly about 50 cents a pound in the Corn Belt. And we can track that kind of the urea price in New Orleans was about $353 per metric ton. But since the Iranian conflict and also just a general seasonal increase in trend on urea, we've seen that not quite double, but almost go up about 80%. So in December, we were at 350 in New Orleans for urea per ton. Right now, the CBOT in New Orleans is 616. So again, not quite a doubling, but almost 80% of that. So if you're thinking related to corn, that adds about another 50 to 100 per acre in costs for nitrogen that you weren't anticipating if you didn't have pre-booked supplies and different things like that. UAN is we've seen similar increases, but urea especially is being really impacted by the Uranian thing, and that partly relates to there's big urea production, nitrogen production facilities in the Persian Gulf and in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia. They don't generally export a lot to the United States, but they generally export a lot to Europe. And those European prices is spilling over into US prices. And so that's what's causing that increase in nitrogen prices that we're seeing related to this conflict. So the longer this conflict goes on, we can't get nitrogen out of the Persian Gulf to Europe. These prices are going to continue to increase. There's going to be continued pressure on margins. and also maybe possibly sourcing of fertilizer going forward. Again, so I'm running out of time. I know there's a lot of information here, but that's kind of why we made this interactive report, try to keep it up to date. So certainly you can cover or look at a lot of this information on your own time. And again, if you have questions, just email me. And my contact information is on the website, so you can contact me at matthew.elliott@sdstate.edu, or you can call me. If I'm not here, leave a voicemail. I always get it. And you can let me know of any issues you might have or thoughts on how to, what data you might want to see or how you might want to see that going forward. But sorry, I didn't have time to really cover the wheat markets, but maybe next time. I'll kind of stop it there, Sarah, and given time where we're at, and if there's any questions, we can finish up on that.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's an amazing tool. That's really amazing, how time saving it is, how you're pulling all this information from all these different sources, and instead of having to go out and gather that, you could just go to your website and it's all right there for everybody. So thank
Yep.
you. And I know we're over time, so if anybody needs to leave, we understand. I'm gonna just drop a link to some feedback in the chat. So if you have some feedback about the AgriCon dialogues or what you want to see, please take our survey, fill it out. We're always listening and responding to what the audience wants. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and open it up to Laura and Matt for more questions. If you're willing to stick around a couple minutes, and so I'll go ahead and stop the recording.